December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The sky above Battleship Row is thick with smoke, and the water is on fire. Somewhere out on the open Pacific, roughly 200 nautical miles west of Oahu, a lone aircraft carrier is steaming hard for home, her flight deck crowded with aircraft. Her crew utterly unaware that within hours their world will change forever. Her name is USS Enterprise. She's meant to be delivering fighter planes to Wake Island. Instead, she is about to become the most important warship the United States Navy has ever put to sea, and nobody aboard her knows it yet. By the time Enterprise finally limps into Pearl Harbor the following evening, the harbor she left is unrecognizable. 8 battleships sunk or crippled, over 2,000 men dead. And yet Enterprise, the ship that should have been there, the ship that very nearly was there, survives untouched by luck alone. What follows over the next 4 years is a story so extraordinary that naval historians still argue about how one vessel could possibly have done so much. This is the story of the ship the Japanese claimed to have sunk on at least 4 separate occasions. This is the story of the Big E. To understand why Enterprise mattered, you have to understand just how badly the United States Navy needed her to matter. After Pearl Harbor, America's battleship fleet, the supposed backbone of naval power, lay wrecked in the mud of Oahu. The doctrine that had governed naval warfare for a generation, the idea that great fleets of battleships would slug it out gun to gun, was suddenly obsolete before a shot had even been fired between the main forces. What remained operational in the Pacific were precisely 3 aircraft carriers: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. 3 ships against an Imperial Japanese Navy that possessed 10 carriers, superior naval aviators, and momentum that seemed unstoppable. The numbers were bleak. Japan's carrier pilots had trained for years under a rigorous, almost merciless selection process, producing aviators of exceptional skill. American naval aviation, by contrast, was still finding its feet, hampered by outdated aircraft and tactics that had not yet caught up with the reality of carrier warfare. Existing American naval doctrine had never truly planned for a scenario where battleships were unavailable and carriers had to carry the entire weight of the Pacific War alone. There was no fallback plan. There was only Enterprise and her sisters, thrown into a fight nobody had properly prepared them for, against an enemy who had spent a decade preparing for exactly this moment. Enterprise herself was not some experimental miracle vessel. She was a Yorktown-class carrier, laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia in 1934 and commissioned in May 1938. Roughly 25,500 tons, fully loaded, 251 meters in length, capable of a little over 32 knots. What made her formidable was not any single revolutionary feature, but the sheer integration of systems working in concert. A flight deck long enough to launch and recover aircraft in rapid succession, hangar space for more than 90 aircraft, and an air group of dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters that, properly handled, could strike an enemy fleet from over 100 miles away, well beyond the range of any battleship's guns. Her aircraft were the real weapon. The Douglas S.B.D. Dauntless dive bomber, in particular, would prove to be one of the decisive instruments of the entire Pacific War. Picture a machine roughly the size of a large delivery lorry, diving almost vertically from altitude at speeds that pin the pilot into his seat, releasing a single half-ton bomb with an accuracy that horizontal bombing simply could not match. The sound of a full squadron committing to a dive has been compared by veterans to a runaway freight train screaming out of the sky. Enterprise's deck crews, meanwhile, became legendary for their speed. Capable of launching a full strike in a fraction of the time, it took less experienced carriers, a rhythm of choreographed chaos that came from months of drilling until it became instinct. Below decks, the scale of the operation was staggering for its time. A crew of roughly 2,200 men lived and worked within Enterprise's hull, an entire small town afloat, with its own bakery, its own hospital, its own print shop turning out a daily newspaper. Aviation fuel, highly volatile and desperately dangerous in combat, was stored in tanks surrounded by seawater compensating systems, an early and imperfect attempt to reduce the risk of the catastrophic fires that had doomed other carriers. The ship's 4 boiler rooms and turbines generated some 120,000 horsepower, roughly the combined output of well over 1,000 family motor cars, driving her through the water fast enough to launch aircraft even in near-calm conditions. Newport News Shipbuilding, the yard that built her, would go on to build further Yorktown-class sisters, though wartime production numbers and modifications were closely guarded, and exact specifications for later refits remain only partially documented even today, scattered across declassified Navy records and shipyard archives. It was at Midway in June 1942 that this combination of ship, aircraft, and crew produced the single most consequential naval action of the war. Enterprise's dive bombers arriving almost by chance at precisely the moment Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. Decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft helped sink 3 Japanese fleet carriers within a few devastating minutes. A 4th would follow before the day was done. Japan's carrier force, the instrument that had delivered Pearl Harbor, never fully recovered. Survivors from the Japanese carriers later described the attack as coming without warning, the sky simply opening above them. The accounts that survive from that morning are fragmentary but vivid. American pilots spoke of spotting the Japanese carriers by the wakes of their escorting destroyers, wheeling into their dives almost simultaneously from squadrons that had become separated during the outbound flight, an accident of navigation that historians now regard as one of the most consequential coincidences of the war. Japanese deck crews, caught mid-rearmament with bombs and torpedoes stacked openly on hangar decks, had no time to clear the decks or launch a defense. Some Japanese records from the battle were destroyed, along with the ships themselves, so the precise sequence of those final minutes aboard Akagi and Kaga is pieced together from survivor testimony rather than official log entries, and gaps in the record remain. What is not in doubt is the outcome, confirmed independently by both American reconnaissance and post-war Japanese accounts. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more of Enterprise's war still to come. Enterprise went on to fight at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, and at Guadalcanal, and by late 1942, she was, for a period, literally the only operational American carrier left in the entire Pacific theater, a fact so significant that news of it was kept from the public. Compare her record with Japan's own fleet carriers, magnificent ships like Akagi and Kaga, beautifully built and superbly crewed, yet lost within the first year of full-scale carrier fighting. Compare her, too, with the British Fleet Air Arms carriers of the same period, such as HMS Illustrious, which pioneered armored flight decks that made them remarkably resistant to bomb damage, a design philosophy the Americans studied closely but did not adopt, favoring instead larger air groups over deck armor. The American approach embodied by Enterprise, traded protection for offensive punch and aircraft capacity, a gamble that paid off primarily because her aviators kept winning the exchanges before enemy bombs ever found the deck. Where Japan built exceptional ships crewed by an irreplaceable cadre of veteran pilots, and lost that cadre catastrophically at Midway, the American system, though initially the weaker force, could absorb losses and regenerate pilots and aircraft at a pace Japan's industrial and training base simply could not match. The contrast becomes starker still when set against sheer numbers. Japan entered the war with 10 fleet and light carriers, but never matched the pace of American shipbuilding. Once Essex-class carriers began entering service from late 1942. Onward, a production surge that eventually put dozens of new carriers into the Pacific. Enterprise, older and smaller than these later ships, nonetheless kept fighting alongside them, a veteran among newcomers, her air group still among the most experienced in the fleet. German naval aviation, by contrast, never fielded an operational aircraft carrier at all. The Graf Zeppelin, laid down before the war, was never completed for combat service, leaving Germany reliant on land-based aircraft for maritime strike missions, a strategic gap that meant no true German equivalent to Enterprise ever existed for direct comparison. By the war's end, Enterprise had earned 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship, and had, according to some tallies, an air group credited with sinking or damaging roughly 71 enemy vessels. Japanese propaganda broadcasts claim to have sunk her outright on several occasions, a claim so persistently repeated and so persistently false that American sailors adopted it as something between a joke and a badge of honor. The psychological effect ran both ways. To Japanese aviators, Enterprise became a kind of dreaded, unkillable adversary. To American sailors across the fleet, her survival became a symbol that the Navy itself could endure whatever it was thrown against,